Brother ruined my marriage and got my wife pregnant out of spite, then expected me to raise his baby after parents revealed an $8 million inheritance and left him out completely. Now he's furious I won't forgive and forget. This might be a long rant, but I'm still in shock over everything that's happened, and I really need to get it off my chest. This is going to be a long one, so buckle up. Let me start with the fact that my brother and I always had a tricky bond. It took me a while to realize that he didn't like me. And very soon that dislike turned into pure hatred. I never knew what exactly was it that I had done, but he hated my guts. I don't know where it came from, but he wouldn't let a single moment go to waste where he could say stuff like I was spineless, and that I was pretending to be better than him. But the truth is, I just worked hard and tried to make something of myself. Our parents weren't wealthy, but they did their best to provide for us. They always encouraged us to pursue our dreams and work hard, but my brother never seemed to take that advice to heart. Growing up, I was always the good kid. I got good grades, participated in extracurricular activities, and tried to help out around the house as much as I could. My brother, on the other hand, always seemed to resent that. He barely scraped by in school, and it was as if every achievement I had became another reason for him to dislike me. I remember one time in middle school when I won a school award for academic excellence. I was so excited and proud to show my parents, but the look on my brother's face was pure disgust. Later that night, he told me I was a show-off and that nobody cared about the stupid certificate. It wasn't just that one incident either, it became a pattern. When I made the high school basketball team, he called me a try-hard. When I got a part-time job to save up for college, he accused me of being a kiss-up to our parents, trying to look like the perfect son. The resentment was relentless, and no matter what I did, he found a way to tear me down. I didn't understand why he was like this, but after a while, I stopped trying to figure it out. It became clear that nothing I did would ever be enough to gain his approval or even basic respect. The worst part was that our parents were caught in the middle. They tried their best to treat us equally, but even their efforts to keep the peace became twisted in his mind. If they praised me for something, it was favoritism in his eyes. If they tried to encourage him to do better, he'd accuse them of comparing him to me. And to be honest, I also felt like they had a soft space in their hearts for my brother. So, to sum it up, our home basically became a battlefield, and it seemed like no one could win. My brother's bitterness consumed him, and instead of seeing me as someone who just wanted to succeed, he saw me as competition in a race he was never willing to run. As we grew older, the divide between us only widened. I went to college on scholarships, something that infuriated him even more. He dropped out of community college after a year, blaming the system and everyone but himself. He never took responsibility for his failures, always finding a way to blame someone else. Most of the time, that someone was me. He told anyone who would listen that I thought I was better than him, that I was a fraud, pretending to be something I wasn't. In reality, all I was doing was trying to build a future for myself. But to him, my success was a personal attack. Our relationship completely deteriorated when I got married. My wife, who was always kind and welcoming, tried to get along with him, but he didn't even give her a chance. At our wedding, I overheard him telling one of his friends that I was a joke, that I'd never make it last, and that he'd give it a year. I brushed it off at the time, thinking it was just his usual bitterness talking, but looking back now, I see it for what it was, a warning. He couldn't stand to see me happy and was already laying the groundwork for the chaos he would eventually unleash on my life. As the years passed, I settled into married life, focusing on my career and the possibility of starting a family. My brother's life, on the other hand, was a mess. He bounced from one dead-end job to another, never staying anywhere long enough to build any stability. His relationships were just as unstable, short-lived flings, toxic breakups, and constant drama. But somehow, despite the differences in our lives, he still managed to worm his way into my personal affairs. At first, I didn't think much of it. He would come around every now and then, asking for money or a favor, and I'd help him out when I could. I felt sorry for him. I figured he was struggling, and maybe if I helped, he'd turn things around. I didn't realize then that his bitterness had already evolved into something far darker. It was subtle at first, small comments, passive-aggressive jabs at family gatherings, little reminders that he was still there, lurking in the background of my life. I tried to help him out. I put the family matters aside, and offered to put in a good word for him at my company, to help him with his resume, and even to pay for some vocational training. But he always refused, saying he didn't need my charity. He'd accuse me of rubbing my success in his face, of trying to make him feel inferior. It was exhausting, but I kept trying because, well, he was my brother. Things started to go downhill about a year into my marriage. My brother suddenly started showing up at our house unannounced, just dropping by when I wasn't home. He'd claim he just wanted to hang out, to reconnect. I was skeptical, but my wife encouraged me to give him a chance. She thought it was sweet that he wanted to mend our relationship. If only I had known then what I know now. But then he started paying a suspicious amount of attention to Emily. There was something off about the way he interacted with my wide. I confronted him about it once, but he just laughed it off, saying I was being paranoid. My wife didn't see the harm in it, so I tried to let it go. I wanted to believe that maybe he had changed, that maybe he was just trying to rebuild the relationship we never had. Over the next few months, my brother became a constant presence in our lives. He'd be at our house almost every day, always when I was at work. I thought it was strange, but Emily assured me it was fine. She said they were just talking, that my brother needed someone to listen to him. I wanted to believe her, to believe that my brother was finally turning a corner. But then things started to change. Emily became distant. She'd pick fights over the smallest things, accuse me of not understanding her. My brother, meanwhile, was suddenly full of advice on how to treat my wife, and how to be a better husband. It was surreal. The guy who couldn't keep a job or a girlfriend for more than a few months was now giving me marriage advice. I should have seen the signs. The lingering looks between them, the inside jokes, the way they'd stop talking when I entered the room. But I was blind, too trusting, too hopeful that my brother had finally changed. It all came crashing down 6 months ago. I came home early from work one day, hoping to surprise Emily with flowers and a nice dinner. Instead, I was the one who got the surprise. I walked in on my brother and Emily in our bed. In that moment, my whole world shattered. The next few weeks were a blur. Emily moved out, claiming she needed time to think. My brother disappeared, probably hiding out at our parents' place. I was left alone, trying to piece together how my life had fallen apart so quickly. When I finally confronted my brother, his response left me speechless. He looked me straight in the eye and said that he had nothing to lose. According to him, I always had everything, and he had nothing. So, he took the one thing that mattered most to me, my wife. I was devastated. Not just by the betrayal, but by the realization that my own brother, my flesh and blood, could be so cruel. He had destroyed my marriage, my trust, my family, all because of his twisted resentment. I filed for divorce shortly after. Emily tried to apologize, to explain, but I couldn't bear to listen. My brother, unsurprisingly, was nowhere to be found. I threw myself into my work, trying to forget the pain and betrayal. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any more complicated, they did. Emily reached out to me about 2 months ago. She was pregnant. And the baby was my brother's. I was numb. It felt like a sick joke, like the universe was playing some cruel prank on me. But it was real. My soon-to-be ex-wife was carrying my niece or nephew. The child of my brother and the woman I had loved and trusted. For weeks, I didn't know what to do. I avoided my family, ignored Emily's calls, and tried to pretend none of this was happening. Every day felt like a blur of confusion and betrayal, and the weight of it all was suffocating. But reality has a way of catching up with you, and it wasn't long before everything came crashing down. I thought I could stay away, distance myself from the mess that my life had become, but my parents weren't having it. Last week, they called a family meeting, insisting that we all sit down and talk. I knew it was going to be bad, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened. When I walked into their house, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. My brother was already there, slumped in a chair, looking as angry as ever. We hadn't been in the same room since the confrontation, and the sight of him immediately set my nerves on edge. Emily was there too, her pregnancy now unmistakable. The sight of her made my stomach turn, and I could barely bring myself to look at her. Our parents sat across from us, looking more serious than I'd ever seen them. The room was silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, and I could feel the weight of what was about to come. I was honestly prepared that my parents would again try to cover for my brother. My dad was the first to speak. He explained that they had been keeping something from us, something they had never felt the need to share until now. Apparently, years ago, they had inherited a substantial sum of money from a distant relative, something they had kept secret, living modestly all this time so as not to spoil us with the knowledge. Dad continued, explaining that they had invested the money wisely and grown it into something bigger, much bigger. $8 million, to be exact. Let me tell you that the shock was very evident. Our parents, who had always lived so humbly, were secretly sitting on a fortune. Before any of us could react, Mom spoke up and explained that they had always planned to leave the money to both of us, their children, but recent events had forced them to reconsider. By now, I knew what was coming. Dad then explained that in light of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the lies, the destruction of my marriage, they had made a decision. The entire inheritance would be going to me. My brother was being cut out completely. The very next moment the room was in pure chaos. My brother leapt to his feet, his face twisted in rage. He shouted about how unfair it was, how they had always favored me, and how he was being punished for one mistake. But our parents stood firm. They said that his actions had consequences and that betraying his family in such a way couldn't go without repercussions. They told him that this decision was final, that he had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. But then, something even more shocking happened. In the middle of his outburst, my brother suddenly stopped. His face suddenly softened. He turned to me, his voice almost pleading. He started talking about family, about how we needed to stick together, about how it was thicker than water. He said that we could put the past behind us, that I should forgive him, and that I should get back together with Emily. He even had the nerve to suggest that I should raise the baby as my own because, after all, it would share my DNA. He actually thought that would be enough to make me forget everything he'd done. I sat there, stunned. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the audacity of what he was suggesting. This man, who had spent his entire life resenting me, who had destroyed my marriage and gotten my wife pregnant, now wanted me to forgive and forget. All because of money? And that's when I lost it. I couldn't stop myself. I started laughing. It wasn't a happy laugh, it was bitter, hollow, the kind of laugh that comes from a place of pure disbelief. I laughed in his face, watching as the hope in his eyes turned to confusion and then to anger. He was joking, right? I finally managed to say, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and incredulity. He destroyed my marriage, he got my wife pregnant, and now he wants me to raise his child? Also he can get his hands on the money? My brother tried to backpedal, stammering out excuses, but I didn't want to hear it. I cut him off, telling him that he was no longer my brother. That whatever family bond we had was gone. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I turned to Emily and told her that while I wouldn't stand in the way of her raising her child, I wanted nothing to do with either of them. The look on her face was heartbreaking. She opened her mouth to say something, but I didn't wait to hear it. I stood up, leaving the room without another word. That meeting left me feeling drained, like a weight I had been carrying for years had finally lifted. For the first time in my life, I felt free from my brother's resentment, free from the burden of always trying to make things right, free from the toxic cycle that had defined my relationship with him. But at the same time, I felt this bizarre emptiness in my chest. The weight of betrayal was still there, and it wasn't something I could easily shake off. It's been a week since the meeting, and I'm still processing everything. I know there are tough times ahead. The divorce still needs to be finalized, and I'm sure there will be more drama with my brother over the inheritance. But part of me wonders if cutting him and Emily off entirely was the right thing to do. He is, after all, still my brother. And the baby, no matter how it came to be, is innocent in all of this. I've been going over everything in my head, trying to make sense of it. Was I wrong to walk away from it all? Should I have given my brother another chance, tried to salvage some semblance of a relationship for the sake of family? Or was I justified in cutting him out of my life after everything he did? Am I the a-hole for laughing in his face and refusing to raise the baby, even though it's technically family? Update 1. First of all, I want to thank everyone who commented and shared their perspective on my situation. I can't say I was expecting so much feedback, but your words helped me see things more clearly. I've spent a lot of time reflecting, trying to understand the whirlwind of emotions I've been feeling since everything went down, and it's been eye-opening, to say the least. In the days following the family meeting, my phone has barely stopped buzzing. My brother has been relentless, calling me constantly, leaving voicemails, and sending texts that I haven't even bothered to read most of the time. The few I have looked at were all variations of the same message: he needs me. He's pleading for my help, claiming he's in over his head and doesn't know how he's going to raise the baby without my support. He's gone into excruciating detail about how difficult things are for him, how he can't do it alone, and how, as the baby's uncle, it's my duty to step up. At first, I tried to ignore it. But it's hard to ignore someone who is bombarding you with dozens of texts a day, all saying the same thing. My brother seems to think that if he just keeps pushing, eventually I'll cave in. But the truth is, every message he sends makes me even more sure that I'm doing the right thing by staying away. It's becoming more and more clear that my brother isn't reaching out because he genuinely wants to repair our relationship, he's doing it because he's scared. Scared of the consequences of his actions, scared of raising the baby alone, and, if I'm being honest, probably scared of losing out on the inheritance altogether. Then there's Emily. She's been reaching out too, though not as frequently as my brother. I've gotten a few messages from her, mostly apologetic, saying she's sorry for what happened, that she didn't mean for any of this to happen, and that she wishes we could talk. But I can't bring myself to respond. The betrayal still stings too much. In the beginning, when everything first came out, I was so focused on my brother's actions that I almost ignored the fact that Emily betrayed me too. She wasn't some innocent bystander in all of this, she made choices. She let herself be manipulated, or maybe she wasn't manipulated at all and simply made a decision. Either way, it's hard to look at her and not feel a deep sense of hurt and disappointment. I've also been hearing things from some of my parents' neighbors, and it's got me worried. Apparently, my brother has been causing a lot of trouble at my parents' house. According to the neighbors, he's been showing up unannounced, banging on their door at all hours, crying and begging to speak with them. One neighbor even told me they heard him shouting about the inheritance, calling my parents liars, and saying they owed him. I can't believe the nerve of him, going to their house and causing a scene like that after everything he's done. It seems like he's reaching a breaking point, and I'm starting to fear for my parents' safety. I'm planning on visiting my parents soon, just to check in and make sure they're okay. I haven't spoken to them since the bombshell about the inheritance, and part of me feels guilty for that. They've always been there for me, supporting me through everything, and now that things have taken this ugly turn, I haven't been there for them like I should have. But to be honest, I'm dreading the conversation. I know they'll want to talk about the inheritance, about the future, and about what I'm going to do next. And I'm still not sure what to say. I keep hoping that the situation will calm down, that my brother will finally accept that his actions have consequences and stop trying to force his way back into my life. But I know that's probably wishful thinking. If anything, it feels like things are going to get worse before they get better. My brother has always been relentless, always pushing until he gets what he wants, and I don't see him giving up anytime soon. At this point, I don't know what to do. I'm trying to focus on moving forward with my life, but it feels like I'm stuck in this never-ending loop of drama and betrayal. I'm dreading the thought of having to deal with my brother's anger and entitlement for who knows how long. And Emily. I don't know if I'll ever be able to face her again. Part of me wants to cut them both out of my life for good, to move on and never look back. But another part of me wonders if that's too harsh. I've been asking myself these questions nonstop, and I still don't have an answer. Maybe I'll never have one. But I do know one thing for sure, I can't keep living like this, caught between anger, betrayal, and guilt. Something has to give. Update 2. A few days after the chaos of the family meeting, I finally made the decision to visit my parents. I had been putting it off, unsure of how to face them after everything that had happened. But the constant news from their neighbors about my brother's escalating behavior left me no choice. I couldn't just sit by and let him continue to terrorize them. They didn't deserve that, not after the stand they'd taken against him, and certainly not after years of trying to support both of us. When I arrived at their house, I could see the exhaustion etched into their faces. My mom looked like she hadn't slept in days, and my dad seemed worn down in a way I hadn't seen before. They were both so tired, not just physically, but emotionally. My brother had been showing up unannounced almost daily, making a scene outside their home, and shouting loud enough for the neighbors to hear. He'd been trying to guilt-trip them into reconsidering their decision, making up stories to paint himself as the victim in front of anyone who would listen. When that didn't work, he turned to outright harassment, raising his voice, banging on the door, and trying to attract attention in any way he could. Sitting down with them, I could tell how much this whole ordeal was weighing on their minds. My dad was the first to speak, his voice heavy with fatigue. He explained that they had given my brother chance after chance, hoping he would calm down, hoping he would eventually realize the gravity of what he'd done. But instead, he had only ramped up his efforts, growing more desperate by the day. My mom said to me that they couldn't take any more of this and they had done everything they could, but their older son was just not going to stop. They looked at me then, and I realized what they were asking. They wanted me to make a decision about the inheritance. It was clear they had made up their minds, my brother wasn't getting anything. But now they were passing the responsibility to me. It was my money, and they wanted to know what I intended to do with it. They weren't pushing me in any particular direction, but I could see the unspoken plea in their eyes. They just wanted peace. I could feel the weight of their words settle on my shoulders. For a moment, I thought about all the years I had spent trying to be the better person, trying to rise above my brother's cruelty. But this wasn't just about me anymore. My parents were tired, too tired to keep fighting this battle alone. And as much as I had tried to stay out of the mess my brother had created, I knew I had to step up now. Not just for myself, but for them. Just as I was about to speak, we heard the sound of tires on gravel. I glanced out the window, and sure enough, my brother was pulling into the driveway. The tension in the room skyrocketed, my parents exchanged nervous glances. I knew exactly why he was here. He was going to try to grovel again, maybe offer some half-baked apology, hoping that I'd magically change my mind and hand him a slice of the inheritance. But after everything that had happened, there was no way that was going to happen. I didn't wait for him to knock. I stood up and opened the door, blocking him from coming inside. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know. He was there to grovel, probably hoping that his sad little story would soften my heart. But I was done. Before he could even launch into his pitiful speech, I cut him off and told him not to waste his breath and that he wasn't getting a single penny from me. I could see the shock register on his face, but I didn't stop. I said to his face that all he ever did was bully me, tear me down, and make my life miserable. And now, after he had destroyed my family, he must have been delusional to think that I owed him anything. He started to stammer, trying to backpedal, but I wasn't in the mood for any of it. I told him that I didn't care what sob story he came up with this time, but he had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. I could feel my parents behind me, their unease growing as the confrontation escalated. But I wasn't finished. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that Mom and Dad have been more than generous by not calling the cops on him for the way he had been harassing them. But I'm not as patient as they are, and if he kept showing up at their place, making their lives hell, I will call the police. And I won't hesitate to press charges. For a moment, there was silence. I could see the panic flash across my brother's face as he realized I wasn't bluffing. He knew that I meant every word. And then, just like that, his whole demeanor changed. The fake bravado he'd been wearing like armor crumbled, and he shifted into his victim role, the one he'd been practicing for years. He started talking again about how hard his life had been, how everything had gone wrong for him, and how he had nothing left. He rambled on about the baby, how he needed my help, how we were still family. But none of it mattered to me anymore. I had heard it all before, and I was done listening. My parents remained silent, watching as my brother's story grew more pitiful with each passing second. I could tell they were uncomfortable with how far things had gone, but they didn't interrupt. I think they knew, just as I did, that nothing was going to change unless someone put their foot down. Eventually, realizing that no one was going to give him what he wanted, my brother stopped talking. He stood there for a moment, waiting for someone to say something, but the silence stretched on. Finally, he turned and walked back to his car. There was no more anger, no more pleading. Just resignation. He knew that no one was going to listen to him anymore. As I watched him drive away, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my life again. My brother had spent years trying to tear me down, but now he was out of options. I wasn't going to let him drag me, or my parents, down with him. After he left, I turned back to my parents. They looked at me, clearly relieved but also a little shaken. I knew this hadn't been easy for them. Cutting ties with their own son wasn't something they had ever imagined they would have to do. But they understood that this was the only way forward. We couldn't keep living in the shadow of my brother's toxic behavior. The rest of my visit was quieter, but the air felt lighter somehow. We talked about the future, about what I wanted to do with the inheritance. They didn't pressure me, but they made it clear that it was entirely my decision. For the first time, I felt like I had real control over my own destiny, free from my brother's constant resentment and manipulation. I knew that things weren't over yet, there would be more drama, more fallout from my brother's actions, but for now, I felt a sense of peace. I had finally stood up for myself, and that felt damn good. Update 3, a few weeks passed, and the divorce proceedings were nearing their end. Since Emily and I were in agreement, it was uncontested, which made the process much quicker than I had anticipated. I couldn't say it was easy, but there was a sense of finality to it. The marriage, the betrayal, all of it was coming to an official close. However, there was one thing I knew I needed to do before I could fully move on. With the $8 million inheritance, I knew I had more money than I would ever need. It wasn't lost on me how ironic it was that my brother's resentment and actions had led to this inheritance being mine alone. But I wasn't the type to let it go to waste or hoard it out of spite. I made some smart decisions, investing a significant portion into safe stocks, real estate, and other ventures to secure my financial future. My parents, though, had always been passionate about giving back, and I asked if there were any charities they wanted to support with part of the money. They had a few in mind, causes they had quietly supported for years, and we made donations in their name. It felt right to give back in some way, to use the money for something positive, rather than letting it be a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong. But there was still one more thing I needed to take care of: Emily and the baby. Despite everything that had happened between us, I didn't hold anything against the child. The baby would be innocent in all of this, and she didn't deserve to pay for the sins of their parents. I reached out to Emily and set up a brief meeting. It wasn't about reconciliation, far from it, but rather about clarifying that I was setting up a trust fund for my niece or nephew. I made it clear that this wasn't about her or my brother, but about ensuring the child would have a secure future. It wasn't their fault their parents had made such terrible choices, and I wasn't going to punish them for that. The meeting was brief and to the point. I wasn't interested in lingering or reopening old wounds. But during the conversation, I learned something that didn't surprise me as much as it should have. My brother had abandoned Emily and the baby. After all his groveling, all his begging for me to step up and provide for the child, he had decided to leave them both when his manipulation didn't work. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same man who had destroyed my marriage and begged me to help him raise this child had now walked away from both of them without a second thought. It was strange, but I didn't feel anger when I heard that. I just felt a sense of finality. My brother had shown, yet again, who he truly was, and I was no longer surprised by his behavior. The trust fund would ensure that the baby wouldn't suffer because of their father's failures, and that was all I could do. I didn't need to get involved in their lives any more than that. My chapter with Emily, and with my brother, was finally closed. As I walked away from that meeting, I felt lighter. I had done the right thing, the responsible thing, and now I could move on with my life. The inheritance was taken care of, my parents were safe from my brother's harassment, and I had ensured the child's future. All the loose ends were tied up. Or so I hoped. For now, though, I'm content. I've made my peace with everything that's happened, and I'm ready to move forward. Thanks to all the support from this community, I've gained the perspective I needed to navigate this mess. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I've done everything I can to close this chapter of my life the right way. Thank you, Reddit, for all the advice and encouragement. This is where I say goodbye and hope this is the end of it all.